So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Chaim Goodman-Strauss in the National Museum of Mathematics. He's going to tell us about how the world fits together.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you.
I thought I should choose an appropriately grandiose title for since we've had many others. So of course, I don't really, I mean, that is pretty grandiose, but I think that I certainly find inspiration, and I think many of you here do as well, just looking at a pile of mulch and thinking about these complicated shapes and how they might fit together and pack. So with that, I would like to say I'm very, very thankful to be here and very excited by by this conference and the themes that are being discussed, and very glad to be in contact with all of you here. This is obviously a topic that how the world fits together seems to be more or less the theme of the show here, and it's obviously very fascinating to me. And so I hope to mention some of the things that I've been responding to as we go along. So this talk is a little bit organized, a little funnily. So it was advertised as about this hack tile, and the hack tile, has a lot of attention and notoriety. And so what I want to do, though, is kind of touch on a number of other things as well. So basically, I'm kind of squeezing the hack tile talk into the front, so that I can touch on some other related issues. So just quickly, a shape, and I could use the word tile, but it's confusing. So I'll just use the word shape to mean any kind of a shape. And specifically, we could put additional conditions of all sorts on this. But I think if we just literally mean the kinds of things we might mean by a shape, that is to say a closed topological disk with rectifiable edges or something. It's a so-called monotile, meaning that we can use it to form a complete tiling of the plane. So the word monotile is just a pedantic way of just being able to, in a shorthand way, say that this shape, you can fit together copies and cover everything. And so here's an example of why the L tile is a monotile. It wouldn't take much imagination. And we can tell that this particular tiling by the L tile is periodic just by shifting it over. And what I mean specifically is that there's some translation there somewhere in the middle there, that everything lines up again. And of course, equivalently, you can see that it's just simply having a finite chunk that can be repeated. Although I should say that in higher dimensions, this is not, there's a lot more subtlety in what we exactly mean by periodic and exactly what we mean by a fundamental domain or a piece that could be repeated. We can also form from this same shape, we can form non-periodic tilings. And this isn't a great trick. All I've done here is more or less at random flip some of the rectangles. And if this is done completely randomly across the plane, I mean, it is 0% chance that it would somehow maintain this periodicity. Any period would likely be messed up by just some random flip somewhere. But nonetheless, it's worth noting that this is a global property, and that any finite portion of the plane is absolutely insufficient to determine whether or not a tiling is periodic or non-periodic. This is really a feature of something at infinity. So like what I showed you initially, sure, it looked pretty non-periodic, but then we zoomed out and it wasn't. But nonetheless, the main point here is that an L tile can form both periodic and non-periodic tiling. So to summarize, a shape is a monotile if it can be formed to use a complete tiling of the plane. And it's aperiodic if somehow, unlike the L, it can form only non-periodic tilings, which at this point should seem fairly miraculous. And it is. I mean, it is miraculous. And let me emphasize that this is a subject that I've known about since I was a teenager. And it's not hard. I'm not faking it. It still seems miraculous. I mean, it really is amazing. It's an amazing phenomenon that somehow you would have a single, any collection of tiles that would somehow mess up the periodicity at all scales. And so I'll describe something about that, but the L isn't one. So I guess just to kind of get this out of the way in a sense, I think that this got a lot of attention this year, and for which I'm grateful. So let me emphasize that the Dave Smith is the actual discoverer of the hat tile. He's it's not clear what to call him. He's certainly a mathematician. He's not a mathematician who has any training or job or anything. He's a retired printer, but in the way that he explored and sought this, he approached it very much the way that many mathematicians would. He had a very clear idea of where to look, and he looked there and he found something, but he wasn't enough of him. Wasn't trained enough to finish it himself. So he called us in. And so that's how I got involved. And very glad to have been part of that story. Because as you'll see, I've been working in this area for decades, and so this is kind of the culmination, in a sense, of a larger program, which I'll sketch out a little bit about. So this is the first known aperiodic monotile, and just to say a few words about it. So when Dave had an idea for a class of tiles to look at, and what Dave does is he explores different, as part of his hobby or work or pastime or something. He goes through sort of libraries of possible interesting shapes to explore, and then he has some of you may know what a cricut is. It's a computer controlled cutter that's often used for fabric or scrapbooking or something, or by mathematicians if the occasion demands it. So Dave cuts out these tiles and he assembles them, and then he discovers whether something's interesting or not. So he got sort of stuck on this and approached Craig, who has this software that he had developed over time that can enumerate larger and larger patches. The software was very much a secret weapon of sorts in this exploration, simply because some of the calculations really would be incredibly tedious by hand. So anyway, Craig produced this patch back in November or December, and then really I have to say this impresses me greatly, because then Craig saw within it this structure, and within the structure this was enough to kind of get things off the ground, to begin to have insights into how to chase down the potential structure of this thing. I'm going to talk a bit more about the general philosophy about how to prove these things, how to prove that a tile is an aperiodic monotile in a little bit, but I'm just going to sketch it now. Again, what this is going on here is that this single tile can form, the claim is that this single tile can form tilings of the entire infinite plane, and that these tilings that it can form must be non-periodic, must never quite repeat. And so the real mystery is, I guess the first mystery is just sort of what is this phenomenon, and how can one even attempt to do this? And that's what my involvement in this project is, because I know a lot about that. And then, but then the sort of another mystery is, why does this tile particularly work? What's happening for this particular example? And I have to say, as I'm going to go through, I talked last week about how the theory of computation and things like that play a role in these kinds of questions. I'm going to sort of quickly go over some similar parts of that. Because of the very inherent nature of some of these questions and some of the issues that are lurking around beneath them, it's not terribly surprising to me, but there really is no real reason, in the sense that one can explain as a human being in a short, understandable, satisfying way why this works, at least now. But I also think there'll never be, likely. This is not something that could be, this was not designed, and this at the moment could not be designed. This was discovered. So there's often this question of whether math is invented or discovered, but in some cases it's pretty obvious. This really was completely discovered, in the sense that it was sought after, but it was not designed, it wasn't chosen. So just very quickly, the way that this works is something like, essentially by magic, and this isn't the only way to look at it. This is the way we looked at it at first, but I think I might change this in the future. But this certainly explains the basic idea. is that essentially by magic, when you have a patch by these tiles, they have to be uniquely and well-definedly subdivided into these smaller clusters like so. And that, again, this is a computer search that just basically evaluates, all possible ways of fitting them together and then just verifies that this is so. So again, the computer searches were a big part of the details of the proof. And so here we have these four mysterious tiles. And then as I'll discuss the general style of proof in just a little while, but just to kind of get the hat out of the way, basically, the point is that those structures can only form in chasing them down. When those shapes are fitted together, they can basically only form larger and larger copies of themselves. And I'll explain in a little while what the general idea of why this works is, but just in the context of the hat tiling, this little cluster basically can only form, the only thing it can do is basically form a cluster of three larger ones with a little hat in the middle. And that's sort of, in a sense, a larger one of these. And what do I mean it's a larger one of those? I mean that the exact way that little triangular patch fits together with its sort of size tiles, the next size up can also only fit together like these guys. The way that these guys can fit together is essentially with their corresponding larger chunks is essentially exactly the same way as these can fit together. And so in effect, these size tiles are essentially larger versions of those. And in turn, because of that, they can only form in threes with an inflated hat in the middle. And then these in turn behave the same way as the original triangles and so on. And so this is a standard style proof of how we can leverage our way from these guys up to arbitrarily large size patches. These can only form these behave the same way, they can only form these can behave the same way, they can only form those ad infinitum. Why does that prove it's non-periodic? And why does, I'll get to that in a moment with a simpler example. But I guess another question is why do these fit together to form what are effectively larger copies of themselves? And again, there's this very unsatisfying answer, which is that we prove it, we write down the possibilities, but there's no real reason in the sense that one would find satisfying, in the sense of like, oh, well, it's got this some theorem I can point to that explains exactly what. No, it doesn't exist. It's just essentially by magic. It is by magic. Of course, the proof, we have to prove that the magic was working, but there's not really any real reason. And again, this is back to some deep issues with the theory of computation, which I sort of talked a bit about a couple of weeks ago. So another thing about the hat, which is really, it's like this was sort of the gift that kept giving. This was kind of not like the hat itself was plenty, frankly, but then it kept have more and more upon it. So soon, Joseph, one of our co-authors, noticed that that this is within an infinite continuum of combinatorial equivalent tiling. So many of you, if you caught any of the publicity about this, you might well have seen this rather incredible video, this clip. So at most, all but 3 moments, all of these are, you see, it's always exactly pretty much the same tiling. And what do I mean by that? So this is a new thing that we have to worry. The definition for this hadn't really existed in the literature, hadn't been necessary until now, but to come up with some notion of combinatorial equivalence. Clearly, they're really the same tiling. It's just that the way that they're, some sort of distortion. But in fact, they're literally the same in the sense that any tiling by any one of these exactly corresponds to a tiling by any of the others. Any one of these would have been an aperiodic monotile in precisely the same manner as the hat, which is astonishing. And let me just explain what's going on here. So it turns out that the hat has, somewhere around there, the hat has 2 lengths of edge. One is short and one is long. And these actually correspond to natural distances in a hexagon. I didn't include the figure, but there's a natural division of this up into a hexagonal tiling where this is, let's see, this is half the edge of a hexagon. And then this is the diagonal. I don't know, you can't really, I don't know, I should have included it, but nonetheless, the main point is that there's two different lengths of edges and one is, whatever. And then as we're moving through this movie, we're just simply varying the size, the relative size of those two lengths. And so at any point where these two lengths are different, the tiles can only fit together in precisely the same manner as the original had. And so there's a nice other direction here where we've swapped the two lengths and we have what we have called the turtle, somewhere around there. But there's three special degenerate spots. There's one where one of the edge lengths goes to 0. And when that happens, you have more ways the tile can fit together. And suddenly this can allow periodic tiling. So you might even immediately see one. If I, for example, just took this, we call this, well, it's a chevron shape. If you take the chevron, you can easily just go up, straight up and down, make columns of that and stick those together. And the reason that you can do that here and not here is because one of the edges has disappeared. That you cannot make a periodic chunk tiling out of this piece, but you can out of this. And then similarly on the other end, we can let the other side go to 0. And it's not too much work to find a periodic tiling that this can form. And then there's this one in the middle where the two edge lengths are the same. Not there. Where the two lengths are the same. And sorry. And that's an important one. So as I'll mention in just a moment, this allows, wherever that is, the two edge lengths are the same, then this allows, again, more possibilities because now you can flip it over. Where edges that couldn't have matched before now can match. And so this, again, also allows a periodic tiling. So basically, the point here is that there are three special situations where it doesn't work, where it allows periodic tilings, but everywhere else, these are all so not only did we get an aperiodic monotile, it's actually an infinite family of, you can call them the same or different, your choice, aperiodic monotiles. And then this, as I think many of you are aware, there was a tremendous outpouring of creativity, of creative work, as people made the hat tile their own. And Yoshi Arakai particularly is very active in tiling in Japan and promoting it as a subject in schools and doing workshops and so forth. And he's done a tremendous amount of wonderful art. But I like this puzzle a lot because it got right to one of the questions which immediately came up, which is the hat tile, is it really a monotile? And I've had some conversations here. I guess physicists and biologists and chemists would say that if you flip something over, I think, and I hate to presume, anybody who's telling me, if you flip something over, then it's really two distinct shapes. That in physical reality, you know, there's a difference between your left shoe and your right shoe, which you're certainly aware of if you, and in the plane, however, it's not as clear. So it's a really, I think, a cultural question, which I'll turn to in a second. But Yoshi's puzzle here, I think, points to one reasonable answer, which is that it's hard to tell. So, I mean, really, is there one shape of turtle or two? I mean, it's the same decoration, but I don't think that's really satisfying. Ultimately, it's a cultural question whether this is a single shape of hat or two shapes. As was pointed out, another example is if you care about ceramics, obviously it really matters if you have a left-handed ceramic tile versus a right-handed one because the ceramic is on the top. You can't just flip it over. But I will just go as, I'm gonna play a trump card here. So Euclid. So first of all, in the tiling literature itself, there was no real question. It's one tile, and it didn't even occur to us that, I mean, it should have occurred to us, but we just completely forgot about it being an issue until Twitter reminded us. And so just to sort of take Euclid's book 1, prop 4, like clearly, so basically, this is a proof by supposition, superposition, where you take one triangle and you land it on top of the other. And it clearly doesn't make any reference to whether the triangle is flipped over or not. It doesn't really say that use the word congruent. But anyway, if that's not authoritative enough for you, we'll just read it and read. So then, anyway, so, but as if this were not enough, I mean, seriously, this is an unbelievable construction that it just kept going and going. And so the specter showed up, even as this was happening. We weren't ready to announce it, but almost immediately, after the hat tile was announced, we noticed the specter, which is that tile where the two edge lengths are equal, but now you restrict it so that now this gives more flexibility in how it can fit together. But if we further restrict it and say that we can only have the unreflected copies, which can be enforced by just modifying the edges, then this turns out again to be an aperiodic monotile, which is astonishing. And then immediately, here's the specter. This is Rob Batar. So with the specter, it's very nice because you can have these curved edges and so do fun things like this. And then I think, I just want to show, I think many of you might have seen this. So there's a lot of amazing stuff. And I guess I have to say, personally, my main feeling is just, and it's immensely gratifying to see people taking these ideas and making them their own, and having one's research area in the world in this way is just amazing. So we saw cookies, and I'll make to that in a second. All kinds of stuff. That's cute. Of course, the thing is it a hat or a shirt? Twitter is clear it's a shirt, and it's true. It is a shirt. It's not, but we're stuck with the name. It's a hat. So here's the left-handed ones are hats, I guess, and the right-handed ones are shirts. And then just beautiful work. This is a specter fabric, and this is kind of funny. So you can have a beer and a tattoo. And then this is something that is kind of amazing. So both MoMath and the United Kingdom Mathematics Trust have rounded up a whole lot of sponsors for this contest that's worth, I think, more than that. So it's already open, but it's going to close in mid-October. So if you want to try your hand at one of these kinds of things, there's actually quite a lot. It's really going to be aimed at school children as well as just anybody. So that's why the UK MT is involved. So they're going to advertise it to all the schools. So hopefully.
We'll have a tattoo.
You have to get a tattoo if you need that.
We'll have a tattoo.
Oh, I'm not. No. So that's pretty much the hat tile, but I wanted to just sort of touch, so the talk is a little backwards in the sense that I wanted to be able to touch on some other topics, and I didn't want to put the hat tile stuff at the end. So I'm going to sort of now introduce some of the things, some of the broader picture ideas that I've already talked about. So the real question is, when shapes fit together, how complicated can it be? And I think last time I mentioned this and I gave some examples, but since then we've had any number of real world specific examples being discussed in this meeting, and that's really why it's so great to be here. So reality, in these things, when they fit together, it's really, really tough, even for something like sticking circles in a disk or spheres in a cylinder. Any number of examples that we've actually seen here. And I guess at this point, I kind of I had this idea that I would show pictures from other people's talks, like of the cool things that I found very stimulating. And it turns out I don't have them. So you just have to imagine we can remember other people's talks and all the cool things that we've seen about just this question of how things are fitting together and how immensely subtle that is. In spades, absolutely in spades. And so I want to talk about that in the context a little bit. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about this a little bit more in detail about how the theory of computation plays a role in this. And I hope that I would really like to maybe over time imbue that sensibility as broadly as possible, really, because well, it does. The theory is, so anyway, just here's a few examples that I've been showing off for a little while. So I'm on, wait, there's something out of order. Okay, so we can check if a shape isn't a monotile. Let's just sort of stick with the back to tilings and how complex this can be, and sort of very rapidly sketching out some of the ideas that I presented a couple of weeks ago. So if a shape is not a monotile, that is to say, if it does not tile the plane, then you can actually figure this out in a finite amount of time by just enumerating all possible configurations, making larger and larger patches that are covering larger and larger disks. And the so-called H number is of something that doesn't tile, non-monotile shape. Just I meant a shape that doesn't tile, is just a measure of how complicated this calculation might be. So for example, this is by Robert Amann, and this tile, you can enumerate out one complete layer around the central one, a second one, a third one, but the fourth one, you have these gaps. So the fourth layer isn't really quite complete. You kind of can make it work, but it's not really completed.
Is that the only possibility of how it goes wrong by the time you get to the fourth layer, or the
I don't know the answer to that, but it's finite.
Yeah, okay.
So, but I don't know the answer to that question, but certainly four is, this is the maximum. This is as far as you can go. So whatever happens, you'll have some sort of errors of some kind. And so this is by Robert Amann, who is a remarkable person. I mentioned he was also not a professional mathematician. That's something about this area, is that it really, a lot of the fundamental examples, really important examples, have been by non-trained, non-academic, but serious mathematicians, essentially. So this is H number 3, and this was the record for a while. And then in 2000, there was a H number 5 that my student Casey Mann came up with. And then this is the current record with H number 6. So right now, this is the most complicated, in a sense, that a single tile is known to be before they cannot tile. Like anything else that cannot tile would crash somewhat sooner than this. Let me add, though, that this procedure is guaranteed to will halt in finite time if it doesn't tile. But if a tile does admit a tiling, this is not going to, you will never find this out. You'll enumerate larger and larger patches, and just because it didn't stop, doesn't tell you, maybe we'll stop next week or something. But so this is an open question. Is H number unbounded and unknown? And I'll come to that in a second. So we can also check to see if a shape can be used to form periodic tilings by looking for what is called a fundamental domain. That is to say, a chunk, a motif that can be used, a finite clump of whatever that can be itself tiled periodically, that can be used to generate the tiling. So I'll show an example in just a second, but the isohedral number of a shape is the smallest size of a fundamental domain that it allows. And this is also a measure of complexity. So this is also a world record due to one of our co-authors, Joseph Myers. I've been using this example in talks for 20 years now. I really have been, because this is the simplest. It does tile periodically, but this is the simplest possible thing it can do. This is the simplest. So this is the most complex, simplest possible. This is the simplest possible thing it can do, and it is the most complicated example of this. So it has isohedral number 10, and that's the record at the moment. So another question, again, that's unknown is isohedral number unbounded? And this sort of speaks to, I think, some of the themes here, in the sense that we can see that this one shape is somehow fitting together in some crazy way with itself, that every component of it, or marking or constraint or something, seems to be playing multiple roles in some mysterious fashion. And that, again, is also a feature of, that's again something that one expects from the theory of computation. So there's a lot there that I would like to go in more depth at some point with somebody. So in any case, we can ask, given a monotile, whether the shape admits that's not a monotile. We can ask, given a shape, whether or not it is a monotile, whether or not a shape does admit a tiling of the plane. And we can ask really, is there an algorithm to decide this question? So we're taking a tile as input, and then it would ask, again, I'm using the word monotile means it admits a tiling of the plane. So is the shape a monotile? Is the shape admit a tiling of the plane? And what we're really asking, so I think there's people from a very diverse backgrounds here. So there are actually problems in mathematics that you can prove there's no procedure to solve. And that's, to me, one of the most incredible discoveries of the 20th century is that mathematics can actually establish limits to its own understanding, like formally and rigorously with proof. That you can prove there are certain things beyond proof, which is absolutely amazing. And so this question here, is it beyond proof? Is there actually a procedure or not to decide whether or not a given shape admits a tiling? And it's pretty plausible that this is so. But as I described, that there would possibly be no algorithm. That's an open question, that there may actually be provably no algorithm that could decide whether or not a given tile is monotile. And similarly, okay, is Hessian number unbounded? Is isohedral number unbounded? Does there exist an aperiodic monotile? The reason I'm bringing these all up is that that the procedure I just sketched out kind of combines all of these things. So if there was no aperiodic monotile, which we now know there is, then the monotiling problem could be decided because you just enumerate larger and larger patches, and either you find a fundamental domain or you run out of step possibilities, and either way you know that it tiles or doesn't tile. The catch is, though, if you have this possibility of aperiodicity, then you have then you're out of luck. So there's this is kind of typical of these kinds of implications that sort of connect these themes. And this is really this is very, very general. Here I'm describing it for a single tile in the plane, but this holds all over the place as long as we're careful to sort of describe exactly what our setting is, what we're talking about. But basically, if the so-called monotiling dominant problem, the monotiling problem is the same thing. If the monotiling problem is undecidable, that would have implied this and implied this. But we know actually, of course, now that that's open, and now we have that filled in. And again, this kind of landscape is very, very general. This kind of pattern of questions and implications is very general. So this is the big bang of the subject in 1961. So we already know that there's an aperiodic monotile. I told you that we know there's aperiodic sets of tiles, but where they come from is exactly this decidability question. So Hao Wang was a logician, and he was wrapping up this, at that time, 40-year-old program that Hilbert had initiated in formal logic, in the foundations of formal logic. And he had converted a certain logic question into a question about, see, logic and many other subject areas, you really are fitting things together. You're fitting, say, symbols on the page that have to be compatible with the way that they look. And if in a logical derivation, the symbols on one line have to fit together with the symbols on the next line in a certain well-defined way. That's all, similar things are all over the place. And then Hao Wang was in this manner converting questions from logic to questions about tiling. And this is just a clip from his text, but basically he's saying here that he's just saying more or less what I just said, that if there's no set of aperiodic tiles, then we would have a decision procedure to tell if you could tile a plane. Obviously, it's a totally different language, but that's what he's saying. And he conjectures that that there's no such thing as an aperiodic set of tiles. And of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff that follows from that. So Robert Berger, his student, gave a set with a tremendous number of tiles right away, and he also proved the undecidability of the domino problem. And his method of doing this became the basis of many, many other constructions. It's also more or less what about half my career has been, is exploring this. And so it's not the only method. In fact, to the contrary, because of these undecidability results, one should expect that there will be no shortage of methods. and that this is a 0%, 0% of the possibilities are known to us. But nonetheless, this is the dominant way that the literature has unfolded and that our understanding has appeared. And so this is the same as with the hat tiling, has the same features as about what I'm about to show you, but this is a much more understandable example. So here we have the L again. The L, remember, does not admit, is not non-periodic, but it does form, I mean, not aperiodic, but it does form very special non-periodic tilings that have a special kind of hierarchy, what we might call hierarchical tilings, using what I think could be naturally called a tiling substitution rule. So we take the tile, we make it bigger, and we subdivide it. And in some sense, we repeat this process ad infinitum. You have some sense that this will define tilings of the entire infinite plane by growing and subdividing, growing, subdividing, growing, subdividing. That's true. But actually to define these tilings takes considerably more care to be really right about it. But the sense that you undoubtedly have is essentially on the mind, essentially right. You grow the patch, you drew that again, you grow that, and eventually you get these tilings of the entire infinite plane. Now, the feature here is that every individual tile lies within, any individual tile lies within a larger L uniquely, and then that lies within a larger L uniquely, and then that lies within a larger L uniquely, and so on. So the red within the orange, within the brown, within the green, ad infinitum. And so we have a tiling like this in the result. And that certainly, offhandedly, you know, your eyes undoubtedly, when you look at something like this, it's impossible, I find, for my eyes not to drift across it and sort of things blur together. And precisely because it has this repetitive quality, it seems like maybe it's periodic. I mean, everywhere you look, you see the same kinds of features over and over again. And that's really there, but nonetheless, it is not periodic for a simple reason. When I overlay the hierarchical structure, again, every individual tile lies within a unique hierarchy of larger and larger supertiles. And so consequently, given any translation, there's some supertile bigger than it. And okay, but that couldn't have left everything invariant. You see there's some problems over here. And that must be because if that had left everything invariant, then say this tile would be in two separate, distinct infinite hierarchies. It'd be in the original one as well as in the new one, but every tile lies within a unique hierarchy. That's essentially the proof of the hat tiling as well. So the hat tiles lie within this infinite hierarchy. The pictures I showed you before of those weird triangles. Every individual hat lies within a triangle, lies within a larger triangle, lies ad infinitum, with no, and uniquely, and therefore the tilings have to be non-periodic. And since that's the only thing they can do, they must be therefore aperiodic. And here's a cute little picture. Okay, so nonetheless, this is a aperiodic monotile. I really wanted to show you a number of things. Sorry, the L tile is not an aperiodic monotile, but this is another set of tiles that can only form those hierarchies by just, again, some magic. And this is one of mine from almost 30 years ago. And so we have many others. I'm not sure why this is all cut off. But I want to use a few minutes just to discuss a few other kinds of, a range of topics that sort of are maybe philosophically related to, at least to the kinds of things that we're seeing in this meeting. So one thing is, there's a whole variety of these tiling substitution rules and different ways that you could form these hierarchical structures. And so we do have this result from a while ago. So it turns out that for any substitution tiling rule, there's a way of so here's one where we have this so-called sphinx. This shape, this sphinx, well, it's reversed. This sphinx shape forms, 4 of those form a larger one, and 4 of those can form a larger one, and so on ad infinitum. This system of markings here, which I'm not going to explain, essentially forces the sphinx tiles, these sphinx tiles with these signaling markings can only form, the sphinxes can only form these larger sphinxes, they can only form these larger sphinxes still, and only form those larger sphinxes still. And the mechanism essentially is just to very carefully account for all the different things that can happen, create signals that kind of can only do that. So every one of these tiles has two active sites that describe more or less how it fits with its siblings, I would say, inside of its parent. And then they can only form those, and then those in turn can only sort of set up the signaling for the next layer up. Essentially, every site has sort of two places that identify its role in the next level of the hierarchy. And then those are going to force the next layer up to work. There's obviously a tremendous amount of technical information. We have that. We also have another way of engineering tiles. So here's a cute example in that these are just so we can kind of program tiles in an interesting way. So there's a collection of 211 tiles that by just plucking out different subsets of them, we can enforce a whopping 25,000 different distinct substitution systems. So this is a sort of a very small subset of it. This is these little 27 tiles or so. By plucking out different bits of it, we can just sort of choosing different sort of sub collections of these. We can enforce various kinds of substitutions. You might notice that here, these are all formed by rectangles in this arrangement of, it's called the chair, the table, where you have two vertical on the sides and two horizontal in the middle. But they do it with various kinds of, that's at the top, but they're variously flipped around in other kinds of arrangements. Here, the four rectangles are this way, and here they're kind of arranged in some crazy way. By choosing the different tiles, we can actually sort of program in exactly which ones of these hierarchical structures we want to allow at every level. So that's just another thing. I'm just putting that out there as another kind of control that we can have in these constructions. And here's some examples of the variety. So each one of these can be faithfully controlled by just which, these are clearly optically, you can just see there's a very distinct kinds of structures. These can be just by selecting out which of those tiles we use, we can enforce one or the other 24,000 others. And then also I've mentioned a couple of times that there can be no perfect local assembly rule. So this is a big problem for anybody that is actually interested in assembling these tiles. So if you actually want to put together the hat tiles, the only real way to do it is to, at the moment at least, is to basically to make these large patches and then group those, pull those together, make larger patches still, and pull those together, make larger patches still. Because the theorem that I'm referring to here is really powerful and kind of upsetting in some sense. So it's that if you have any aperiodic set of tiles, then and any radius that you're allowed to look at as you're to examine them, and you want to have some sort of rule that tells you which tile to place given that size window, then too bad, it's not going to work. That's basically the content of this theorem, that any size window that you have, there'd be some configuration of tiles that would look just fine inside any patch of that size, but then could not be completed to an entire tiling of the whole point. And that's true for any aperiodic set of tiles. And so I discussed the proof of that it's not very hard, in the context of the hat tiling a couple of weeks ago. But I did want to mention today, though, that there's several ways around the theorem if you are allowing various kinds of trickery. So this is, or not trickery, just their theorem really rests upon the fact that tiling is homogeneous, that there's no special seed or no special signaling. And so one way around it is just to put in a special seed or special signaling. So this is something like one of the Robinson tiles, and these are an aperiodic. This is an aperiodic set of tiles by itself, but here this is purely self-assembling by a fairly simple algorithm. It's just that if there's a spot where only one tile will fit, then put it, and there's one special kind of place where you might have a choice and you just choose randomly. And you can see that it's doing a great job. You can also see this kind of clearly on top of this kind of signaling structure, which is this kind of scaffolding, which is essential to making it work. So self-assembly is definitely doable, but you have to put on more structure. Another thing, and so here, this is actually a practical question because, so this was done in Oxford last month, and in 2 days, we're going to do one in Newcastle. And so it really is a question, like, how do you actually put these things together as a practical matter? And I have to say, it's kind of neat because this actually uses, I mean, well, basically you put the patches together and try to stick those together and so on. But this really does use some ideas that go way back to the general method of forcing matching rules for arbitrary times. So, and that doesn't work so well. I did want to just sort of touch on a few other sort of assembly questions because so around in this conference have been a number of talks that have talked about like, you know, proteins assembling or colloids assembling or whatever it might be. And I just want to discuss sort of another variation on this, which I've been doing for a long time, which is participation math art. And these are sculptures that are made with people and trying to put them together. So here's where we start and people are standing around and that's where we end up. And I will assure you that people are dumber than molecules. And what I mean is that, sorry, people. What I mean by that is that very specifically that molecules will behave at least somewhat deterministically with following whatever, you know, natural rules are imposed upon them. But I guess people have the free will to mess it up or something. So like, so there's a whole nother layer of just like, you know, figuring out how to make a system that's, well, I mean, it's the same with molecules. You do have to have a system that's robust enough that errors can be flushed out, that, you know, problems can be dealt with. And so we've done a number of these. This one is another one from the same general era. This is from, I guess it's covered up, but this is from 2008. And I guess I should have said, of course, this is the gyroid, which has played a lot of roles here. And here is the, and then this has also sort of come up a few times. It's tessellation on the gyroid that was used to make these plates that people are sticking together here. And then here's another one, which I really like a lot. This is, again, an even worse problem, but it makes this thing here. And so what is this structure? This is fairly familiar. This is, so on the upper left here is the gyroid with the two networks to either side, which I guess you could call the most people, maybe the lattice would be lattice network. I don't know, whatever it's got so many names in the literature. But here's these two networks on either side, and then these sticks going through. These sticks, if you're not aware of it, have this tremendously nice structure that can be made with pencils. So this is the exact same system of lines as in the sculpture in the this sculpture. So these systems of lines are, so this is basically the two lattice networks, one with green on the inside and white on the outside, and the other with white on the inside, green on the outside, and then these two networks of lines. And so the gyroid will be able to sort of swim through that in some manner. And it's a nice, oh, and then this came up in your talk yesterday. See, there's the trousers, but in plaster. And then, oh, and I guess we should all just note that Alan passed away last month, and of course was tremendously influential for, I think, many of us. And it was just a delight and an honor to have him there when that was made. And then sort of similarly, some more kinds of things. So this is definitely the kind of something else that I'm really into. So this is a combinatorial problem that was also assembled in this way, and another one. Again, very interested in exploring hyperbolic geometry in a physical way. And so I'd like to use this moment to just advertise this question. What is up with the Hilbert embedding theorem? It's a real question. So if you ask mathematicians, I mean, I've asked plenty of colleagues, you know, what can you say what is there to say about surfaces of constant negative curvature? And usually people say something along the lines of Hilbert solved that problem, or maybe it was Nash who solved that problem. But the fact is, there's really, I think the problem is that people haven't had the toys. And then when you get your hands on these, you see that there's this very interesting stuff happening. For example, what are the dynamics of these surfaces? This isn't just hypothetical. There are flatfish, for example, that have negatively curved margins, and they seem to me, at least, to be using this dynamical setup to move. That they're actually moving by, depending on how this is set up, but along this, you can kind of roll along these. You can leverage this very greatly because it's narrow on this side and you get a very big motion on it. Small change here and you get a very big change here. And so it makes sense that they're doing something like that they're making small motions, small highly leveraged motions with the little fish muscles, and then getting tremendous motion on the margins. And so, and also I had said, and I will repeat that so my wife's here. That's all I'm gonna say, but she might object, but I was gonna say that I will bet our life savings. But see, it's a good bet, as I'll explain, that some sort of biochemical version of this will be discovered in some cell system somewhere, because nature economizes, and nature, this is a very simple way to generate lots and lots of surface area in a small package. But the thing that's safe about the bet is that I didn't say when. So I don't think I'll be contradicted anytime soon. So it's okay. And then just lastly, so here, just by varying the curvature, you get these wonderful things. Again, these are all made with crowds of people. I unfortunately don't have photographs of people assembling this because I'm usually really busy working at these things. But that's all. I would just like to say, just as in conclusion, though, that so right now I'm really delighted to be here. Delighted to thank you both. Thank you to the organizers, but also very eager to have further conversations with people in this community. And if you want any of this stuff, I'm eager to travel. So thanks.
Thank you. Please.
Do you think people that do something like the hat tile and not have the techniques to prove that it
We know that somebody saw it. So the thing is that we know that, so that's kind of funny. So I'm not completely clear on the story, but there was a someone else in the tiling community had enumerated sort of similar tilings made out of pieces of hexagons and made a list of about 20 that he just couldn't figure out. And so just sitting in that list of about 20 was the hat tile, as well as the turtle. And so then Dave, that's exactly what Dave did. So Dave knew about that. He went to that list and he cut out this out of paper and he just kind of methodically tried out one after another. And so he got it, he found it. So I don't know. I mean, clearly, I don't think, it's not like, yeah, the other person just passed it up. He just said, didn't know, don't know.
Yeah.
So sticking with the hat tile, we talked about reflectional symmetry appearing within the tiles. I wanted to also ask about rotational symmetry and whether it's known how many orientations
Yeah, for sure. So it's pretty straightforward because I don't have it in this talk. No, but that's kind of there. So we can see here that the tiles, it's basically 12. You can see that the tile, basically the tiles go at noon, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6, 8, 10, 12, and then the flipped one's the same. So 12. And it's not, yeah, for sure, because there's this underlying, I don't think you can quite, it didn't really show up where you're sitting, but on my screen, I can see these underlying hexagons. And I think that's even more really remarkable. It's just sitting plop on this hexagonal grid.
So I also had a comment that was more on the hexagonal surface side. These shapes seem almost reminiscent of fungi, or the growth of fungi. Is that known and explored at all?
So there's any number of negatively curved things in the natural world, for sure. I mean, and there's a good, so like for me, like there's all kinds of reasons that might be optimal. For example, increasing surface area, or I mean, I don't know really why lettuce or things like that want to do that, but they do. But another thing that's clear too is if you have a lot of negatively curved surface area, you can hang on to things. So like where I grew up, there were a lot of lichens that had this kind of saddle shape, and then it's obvious to me now why, because they can kind of grip onto branching tree, twigs, basically. So, and then I guess flatfish are doing it for another reason to locomotion, at least in my view.
More questions?
Well, I'd just like to say that we're going to be here for another little while, and there's lots of toys, and I'd also like to share some of them too. So, lighten my load.
Good. Any chance of having a 3D version of the?
It seems to me to be a certainty. So one thing is, it's not really clear how to generalize this in the plane. Like one of the things that's really surprising is just how simple this is, right? I mean, I think honestly, any of us that had given us any thought whatsoever expected something more like, this, except worse, right? I mean, it'd be like this, but 80 times worse was kind of the expectation. And so that something was so simple, well, okay, we see why it was so simple. Maybe it had something to do with being on those nice chunks of hexagons, just gave just the right balance of ways it could fit together. So, well, there's no real obvious further things to try, other than, I mean, they've been tried in the plane, but in 3D, absolutely. You just go to your favorite, the truncated octahedron or something, and then just chop it up into 8 pieces and stick them together in a few ways. And then you need somebody to have the computer program to enumerate patches. That's the trick. So that's essentially, again, the secret sauce here is the computational tools. But it's
the non-convexity of these tiles, is that for some reason necessary?
so yes, now we can say yes, but it's not straightforward. So the convexity, you're not going to be able to tile with a single tile that is convex unless it has 6 or fewer sides. Fewer because it kind of combinatorially you can sort of effectively have 6 tiles, 6 sides. But so enumerating pentagons that can tile the plane was outstanding for almost a century and was only completed a few years ago. And so, but I think with that we can safely, but that was a hard problem that was really resisted analysis and ultimately needed further computer tools. But I think with that, if I'm not mistaken, that would rule out, I think we're done with the convex. But there might be some hexagon that.
I suppose the reason why I'm asking is that if I'm thinking maybe like Simon, and I would use that as an initial configuration for the surface involved when I'm trying to turn this into a thumb.
Yeah.
What would happen if you took your Einstein tile, your Woller tile, and you minimize the edge length?
So
while keeping the tile volume, the tile area fixed.
So we can almost say that, so what they are, almost all are combinatorial hexagons with a few 5s and 7s. So in fact, I can show you exactly I'm in the paper. With a few minutes, I can show you exactly, but specifically, I can show you here that effectively what happens is that each one of these dark blue ones is paired with a light blue one, which not one specific light blue one. And then those pairs and everything else is combinatorially a hexagon. So it's basically a hexagon tiling, but where every one of these blue one, at this density, the hexagons are split and you have a pair of, I think 5s and 7. I'm not sure, we'd have to look at it, but it's basically, if you glom these together, it's a hexagonal tiling.
But so does that mean that if I was to do this, to optimize the length while keeping the tiles like this, could I do this in a way without pulling them apart? I mean, could I do it in a way that it maintains the space tiling nature?
Yeah, I think so. But though you won't, It might be that they no longer all the same shape, though. I think that would be probably what you're getting at.
Because it could, I mean, it doesn't have the same connectivity or topology as a simple hexagonal.
It almost does. That's what I'm saying. If you glom these two together, then it is the hexagonal tiling. It really is. I know it's crazy seeming. But then, so it's like the hexagonal tiling where you're splitting every so after the hexagon. And I guess I don't really know what that looks like when you relax it. But I know it's crazy. So really, actually, the whole nother approach to this is to look at these as hexagons that are kind of distorted. Actually, just to think of them as hexagons, so they've got this kind of weird geometry. But
With the equivalence then between the hexagonal and triangular, how would we be able to do something similar with triangles as we saw in the smaller clusters?
there are triangles here. I mean, I'm not sure. There's the dual triangular lattices sitting there, but I don't know.
Okay, wow, that's been time once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.